The bloody silver bullet hit the floorboards with a dull ping. I thought dragging a dying wolf out of the blizzard would save my soul, but as the beast's bones violently snapped, shifting into 6.5 feet of scarred, lethal muscle, I realized my fatal mistake. I didn't rescue a stray. I just deadbolted myself inside a cabin with the Lycan King. Chapter 1. Freezing rain slashed across the cracked windshield, dragging the stench of scorched copper straight into the cabin vents. Elara strangled the steering wheel. Her knuckles jutted white against the worn leather, the rusted heater blowing dead, icy air across her face. Or maybe the chill was just the adrenaline crashing after the diner. 3 hours a black SUV had idled by the grease trap out back, waiting, watching. She had slipped through the kitchen alley to survive, pushing her dying truck miles up the mountain, only for her headlights to sweep across a slaughter. Red sludge painted the snowdrifts. Instinct took over, driving her boot down hard on the brake pedal. The truck spun sideways, tires screaming against the ice, before stalling inches from a mountain of dark fur. Ribs aching from the frantic hammering in her chest, Elara squinted through the spider-webbed glass. That wasn't a buck. Wind tore through the mountain pass, carrying a wet, broken wheeze. Survival screamed at her to throw it in reverse. She was a packless nobody, carrying a cartel blood debt, and stalling out here was a death sentence. Yet her fingers unlatched the door. She shoved it open against the gale, stepping out into a storm that immediately bit through her thin denim coat. Black hair whipped across her eyes as she waded into the butchery. 15 beasts littered the embankment. They were colossi of black, gray, and brown, heat pouring off their torn flesh to mingle with the biting wind. The sharp sting of seared silver coated the back of her throat. Someone had brought artillery to a knife fight. Knee-deep in the slush, she dropped beside the largest shadow. Pitch-black fur, ribcage barely rising, his flank ripped wide open. A silver slug gleamed inside the torn muscle. Elara reached out. The second her bare skin brushed his coarse coat, a jolt of static snapped up her wrist. She ripped her arm back, lungs locking up. The wolf let out a wet, rattling exhale. Her stomach dropped. Being hunted left a very specific rot in your soul, and she knew the hollow look of someone left to bleed out in the ice. Sprinting to the truck bed, she dragged out the oak firewood sled. Her hands were already numb. Her spine protested. But leaving them out here to freeze wasn't an option. The storm raged overhead, burying the road, pushing her into the dark. By the time the rusty truck groaned into her off-grid clearing, Elara had lost all feeling below her knees. Hauling 15 giant wolves from the flatbed to the porch via a blood-slicked sled had stripped every ounce of adrenaline from her veins. She collapsed onto the hardwood of her living room. The enclosed space instantly choked her with the stench of wet dog, pine needles, and raw copper. Dragging herself across the floorboards, she fumbled with a match. Her hands rattled uncontrollably against the cast-iron stove. A spark caught. Fire roared up the flue, pushing back the freezing dampness of the room. Wall-to-wall predators coated her rug, their bodies shoved against the peeling kitchen table just to fit. The cartel could be tracking her treads right now, but staring at the bleeding beast by the hearth, she grabbed a set of pliers from the junk drawer. "This is going to sting," she muttered, voice cracking against the dry air. She planted her palm flat against his sternum. The heartbeat beneath her hand hit her like a drum. Thump, thump, thump. Brutal, steady. She shoved the rusted pliers into the weeping wound, clamping down hard on the silver shell. Pulling it free tore a deep, bone-rattling rumble from his chest that vibrated straight through the floorboards. The bloody metal pinged into an empty coffee can. She spent the next hour crawling over tails and paws, ripping bed sheets to bind shattered limbs and digging out shrapnel until her fingernails were caked in red grit. Pushing back onto her heels, she wiped sweat from her brow and stared at the dead-bolted front door. The locks were thrown against the blizzard, but the heat in the room was rising. turning the snow on their coats into muddy puddles. The air shifted. It thickened, tasting sharply of static and rain. She pivoted on her boots. The black wolf was shifting. The second the violent crack of breaking bone echoed through the suffocating heat of the cabin, Elara scrambled backward until her spine slammed against the kitchen counter. The beast on her rug convulsed. His terrible shoulder wound stitched itself together right in front of her. Raw flesh weaving tight as steam rolled off his coat. Then, the dark fur dissolved into pale, scarred skin. Limbs lengthened. Spine cracked into a brutal new alignment. The creature collapsed into the shape of a man, kneeling naked on her braided rug. Dark hair plastered against his forehead as his broad chest heaved, pulling the oxygen straight out of the room. He radiated heat. He radiated absolute violence. He lifted his head. Golden, unnaturally bright eyes locked onto hers. The crackling of the wood stove faded into white noise. The roar of the blizzard outside muted to a dull hum. Dust motes drifted lazily through the amber firelight between them, suspended in the sudden, ringing silence of the cabin. He pushed himself up from the floorboards. He cleared 6.5 feet easily, towering over the cramped kitchen island. Elara didn't hesitate. She grabbed the cast-iron skillet from the drying rack, wrapping both hands around the grip. Her knuckles ached from the tight squeeze. "Stay back," she ordered. Her throat was bone dry, but she kept the iron raised high. He didn't blink. He stepped closer, sweeping his gaze down her frame as his chest expanded with a deep inhale. A low, vibrating hum rumbled in his throat, a feral purr coated in razor blades. That same spark from the icy road roared to life under her skin, pulling tightly at her ribs, begging her to drop the weapon and submit. She gritted her teeth, locking her knees to keep from shaking. He stopped inches from her boots. The scent of pine and dark thunder washed over her. He glanced at the skillet, a dark amusement flashing in his gold eyes. Reaching out a broad, calloused hand, he brushed the back of his knuckles down her cheek. The touch was agonizingly slow. "Mine," he rasped. The gravel in his voice rattled the dishes in the sink, and the skillet suddenly felt like an anvil in her grip. The single word dropped between them like an executioner's blade. Elara didn't hesitate. Survival hijacked her nervous system, driving her arms upward to swing the cast-iron skillet straight at his perfect, terrifying skull. She refused to wear a collar. She refused to bleed for a master. Throwing every ounce of her panicked strength into the arc, the iron whistled through the suffocating heat of the kitchen. He didn't flinch. A broad, scarred hand snapped up, catching the iron pan right out of the air. The metal slammed into his bare palm with a dull, sickening smack. Not a single muscle in his face twitched. He just stared down at her, those glowing gold eyes stripping away her defenses. The crackle of the wood stove roared into the sudden vacuum of the room. Sweat beaded on her collarbone as he effortlessly twisted the iron from her white-knuckled grip. Tossing the weapon onto the laminate counter, the metal scraped uselessly against the ceramic tiles. Stepping directly into her space, his chest brushed the frayed wool of her sweater. Heat radiated off his skin, suffocating and thick, smelling of rain and raw violence. "Do not fight me, little one," he rumbled. The bass of his voice vibrated straight through the floorboards into her boots. Terror instantly calcified into blinding, white-hot rage. "Get out of my house!" she shrieked, the raw volume tearing her throat. "Get out!" His golden eyes flared brighter. Tilting his head, the giant studied her defiance as if trying to decipher a dead language. Any normal Omega would be choking on the floor, paralyzed by the sheer crushing weight of his aura. But 5 years of dodging cartel hunters had burned the submissive instincts right out of her blood. The phantom taste of copper flooded her mouth, the exact same metallic tang she swallowed the night men kicked her mother's door off its hinges to collect a debt. Staring at his bare chest, a jagged black brand caught the amber firelight directly over his heart, a crown choked by thorns. It mirrored the cartel's mark, warped and twisted into something older, something worse. Before she could demand an answer, a low, wet, tearing sound erupted behind him. The floorboards groaned. Elara scrambled backward, her spine colliding with the icy enamel of the refrigerator. Flesh tore. Bones snapped with a sickening crunch. 14 wolf shapes contorted in the shadows, melting out of their fur to stretch into long limbs and pale skin. Grunts of agony and deep, guttural curses echoed off the timber walls. Soon, 15 naked, scarred men filled the cramped living space, pulling themselves up from the blood-stained rugs. They moved with the cold, synced precision of a death squad waking from a coma. The air pressure dropped. Her isolated sanctuary had just become a cage. For 10 agonizing minutes, Elara prayed the blistering heat of the wood stove would wake her from this hallucination. It didn't. Instead, the giant with the golden eyes turned his broad back, instantly claiming her tiny off-grid sanctuary as his personal war room. Barking harsh, guttural commands in a language that scraped the inside of her skull, he pointed toward the frosted glass. He pointed at the deadbolted exits. He gestured to her like a piece of inventory. "Secure the perimeter," he snapped in English, his tone demanding absolute, unquestioned compliance. The death squad moved. 2 scarred men ripped her floral curtains straight off the rods, shoving the fabric into the window frames. Another soldier grabbed the edge of her oak dining table, violently dragging it across the floorboards to block the front door. Wood screamed against wood. "Stop it!" Elara lunged forward, shoving past a man with a ruined shoulder to reach the leader. "What are you doing? You're destroying my house!" He looked down, the muscles in his thick neck flexing as he stared her down. "I am keeping you alive!" "By trapping me inside?" She fired back, raw terror spiking her pitch. "You need to leave. If you stay, the cartel will find me." She paid for these 4 walls in untraceable cash. She scrubbed floors under a fake name to earn the right to be invisible. Now, these monsters were dragging a spotlight right to her doorstep. The giant closed the distance between them, completely unbothered by her fury. "They are not hunting you right now," he growled, the sound vibrating low in his throat. "They are hunting me." All the air rushed out of her lungs. The silver bullets, the military-grade artillery. The cartel hadn't finally tracked her down, they had ambushed him. A younger man with ash-blonde hair stepped out of the shadows, clutching one of her bloody, floral dish towels around his waist. "My king," the blonde boy whispered. He stared directly at Elara, his eyes blown wide with absolute shock. He muttered a fragmented word she couldn't understand, watching her like a ghost had just walked out of a grave. King. The title made her stomach turn. Ignoring his soldiers' paralyzed staring, the king kept his golden eyes locked on Elara. "We stay. Until the storm breaks." The oxygen in the room thinned to nothing. Trapped in a 20 by 20 wooden box with the most lethal predators on the mountain. Her hands started to shake violently. Turning away from his suffocating stare, she stumbled to the kitchen sink and gripped the chipped porcelain. A broken, ragged laugh scraped out of her throat. She dragged 15 bleeding beasts into her home to save her own soul, and they were going to get her slaughtered anyway. Then, a mechanical growl sliced through the howling wind outside. Every single man in the room went completely rigid. The guttural rev of an engine ripped away the last shred of Elara's sanity. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. She opened her mouth, but the king threw up a single, commanding finger. Absolute, deadly stillness dropped over the cabin. Nobody breathed. Only the hiss of melting snow hitting the hot iron stove filled the sudden silence. Elara gripped the sink edge until her fingers ached. She knew that mechanical crunch. It was the exact sound of thick tires chewing through frozen gravel right before men with guns dragged someone out of their bed. Pressing his face to a crack between the torn curtains, the king peered into the whiteout. "Scouts," he murmured, his voice laced with freezing, lethal intent. "How many?" the blond boy asked, slipping into a combat stance. 2 vehicles, maybe 8 men. Stepping back from the porcelain sink, her chest rapidly rising and falling. They found the tire tracks, she choked out, her throat tight. They followed my truck. The sickening weight of her own mercy crushed her. She dragged the sled. She left a trail of blood and crushed snow pointing straight to her front porch. Yet, the king didn't snap at her. He turned away from the glass, a dark, violent smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. Gold flared in his irises. Good, he purred, rolling his broad shoulders. Let them come. He wasn't looking for a place to hide. He wanted a slaughter. No! Elara hissed, lunging forward to grip his bare, corded forearm. Her pale fingers barely wrapped halfway around the muscle. You don't understand. They will burn this cabin with us inside. We have to run. He paused, glancing down at her desperate grip. The brutal fire in his eyes cooled, just for a fraction of a second. There is no running in a blizzard, little one. The truth hit her like freezing water. The storm howled against the roof. The trap was locked. Stepping outside meant freezing to death in minutes. Staying meant catching a bullet. They were completely cornered. A bizarre, detached clarity washed the panic right out of her blood. She let go of his arm. Pivoting on her heel, she marched straight to the narrow hallway closet. She yanked the wooden door open, reaching past the winter coats to grab cold, black steel. The sharp, metallic clack of racking around into the hunting rifle severed the silence, snapping every pair of eyes in the room toward her. She refused to wear a collar. She refused to kneel for an alpha, and she sure as hell wasn't going back to the cartel. Ice flooded her veins. Walking straight past the line of towering, naked killers, she took her place beside the boarded window, burying the rifle stock tight into her shoulder. Then we don't run, she stated. Her voice was flat, hollow, and completely steady. The king watched her profile. A low, rolling rumble of absolute approval vibrated deep in his chest, a hot, dangerous sound that settled straight into her bones. 3 brutal blows hammered against the solid oak of the front door. The monster was finally at the gates. She curled her finger over the trigger. Jagged oak splinters rained across the laminate flooring as the front door caved inward. A brutal blast of freezing wind chased the wreckage into the cramped living space, shoving Elara backward. The cold steel of the rifle stock bit hard into her collarbone. The bitter taste of sawdust and powdered snow coated her tongue. A shadowed figure breached the splintered frame. It was a cartel scout, half caught in a violent shift, coarse fur tearing through his jawline while melted ice dripped from his extended claws. He snapped forward, teeth bared for a kill. He never made it past the threshold. Moving with a terrifying liquid speed that defied human physics, the king intercepted the strike. He wrapped one broad, scarred hand directly around the invader's throat. Lifting the thrashing soldier completely off the floorboards, Kaelen didn't even blink. Bone shattered with a sickening, wet crunch. The scout's legs stopped kicking. With a casual flick of his wrist, the king tossed the corpse back out into the blizzard like discarded scrap. Silence rushed back in to fill the void. Only the howling wind outside and the frantic, rhythmic hammering in Elara's own chest remained. Inside the cabin, the remaining scarred men moved with lethal efficiency, dragging the dining table over the shattered entryway and pinning a quilt over the draft to kill the storm. Elara stood frozen against the peeling wallpaper. Her ears rang. She swallowed hard against the metallic tang of pure adrenaline, lowering the barrel of the rifle inch by shaking inch. Watching a man rip the life from a body with his bare hands changed the very gravity of the room. Wiping a smear of red from his pale cheekbone, the king turned to face her. "Are you hurt?" he rumbled, the gravel in his voice shaking the loose dust from the rafters. "No," she rasped, forcing the word past the lump of sandpaper in her throat. He closed the distance between them, his glowing gold eyes dropping to the dark steel in her grip. "You hold a weapon well, but you hesitate. I didn't want to shoot you by accident. The lie tasted sour. A dark, rolling chuckle vibrated in his chest. A silver bullet cannot kill me, little one. Her knuckles turned white against the rifle stock. Why do they call you king? He stopped. The amber firelight reflected in his unnatural irises. Because I rule the Lycan realm. I am Kaelen. All the oxygen fled her lungs. Lycans were ghosts. They were the vicious, ancient apex predators of the shifter world, and an untethered Omega like her was supposed to be dirt beneath their boots. She had dragged a myth into her living room. Before she could find her voice, the ash-blonde boy stepped out of the shadows, dipping his chin in a deep, deferential bow toward her. The rules of her quiet survival were dead. She had to learn the violent laws of these men before sunrise. By the time the grandfather clock struck 10, the biting frost had completely devoured the heat from the struggling wood stove. 15 lethal warriors claimed every spare inch of the floorboards, sitting shoulder to shoulder in the creeping shadows as they tracked the boarded glass. Elara retreated into the narrow galley kitchen, rubbing her numb arms. Pulling her last 4 cans of vegetable stew from the pantry, she twisted the tin lids and dumped the sludge into a cast-iron pot. The sharp aroma of boiled carrots and beef stock finally cut through the metallic stench of the earlier bloodbath. Stacking mismatched ceramic bowls against her hip, she approached the youngest soldier first. He looked completely hollowed out by the silver poison. "Take this," she murmured, pressing the warm clay into his hands. "Thank you, Luna," the boy whispered, ducking his head. Her stomach dropped. Gripping the remaining bowls tighter, she navigated the maze of extended legs and scarred backs, handing out rations. She expected ravenous beasts. She expected them to tear into the food like starved strays. Instead, the warriors balanced the bowls on their knees, completely motionless, staring dead ahead at their king. The floorboards groaned under Kaelen's boots. He rose from his corner and towered over her in the cramped kitchen. "You give away your last meal," he stated, the words flat and observational. "I can survive a few days on water," she shot back, refusing to tilt her chin up to meet his golden stare. "Eat. You're bleeding out." "We do not eat until our Luna eats." The title hit her like a physical blow. Luna, Queen, Mate. The exact labels the cartel used right before slamming the lock on a basement cell. "I am not your Luna," she snapped, her voice cracking like ice. "I am an Omega. You saved my life," Kaelen countered, stepping so close, the heat rolling off his skin chased away the cabin's chill. "My wolf recognizes you. My soul recognizes you." Hot, blinding panic flooded her veins. She slammed both hands directly into the center of his chest. It felt like striking a concrete pillar. "I don't belong to anyone. I won't be a trophy for another pack." Dust motes drifted through the silent tension. He didn't grab her wrists. He didn't force her down. He just stood entirely still. "I do not want a slave," he murmured, the deadly edge gone from his tone. "I want my equal." She didn't buy a single word of it. Monsters always painted their cages gold. Turning her back on the apex predator, she grabbed a dented tin cup of broth, retreated to the far corner by the sink, and sat on the cold linoleum. She lifted the spoon to her lips and swallowed. The second the stew hit her stomach, the entire room of killers raised their bowls and began to eat in unison. The horrific, synchronized respect twisted a knot deep in her gut. She gripped her spoon like a shiv while Kaelen watched her from the shadows, his golden eyes tracking her every breath. Midnight brought a brutal drop in pressure, turning the blizzard outside into a deafening, shrieking wail against the wooden siding. Elara remained anchored to the kitchen linoleum, her knees pulled tight to her chest to stop the shivering. Exhaustion burned behind her eyelids, but sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. She watched the death squad cycle through sleep shifts. Kaelen guarded the splintered entryway, eyes closed, his features carved from unforgiving granite. A subtle, grating noise bled through the storm's howling. It originated from the back bedroom, claws dragging against frosted glass. Every survival instinct in her blood flared to life. Pushing off the cabinets, her bare feet made zero sound against the floorboards as she crept toward the dark hallway. The scratching paused. Then, the master bedroom window exploded. "Breach!" Elara screamed, diving sideways. A feral brown beast crashed through the drywall and insulation, skipping the human shift entirely. Froth coated its elongated muzzle. The cartel wolf hit the hallway runner, yellow eyes locking directly onto her prone form, and launched itself forward. Adrenaline ripped through her muscles. She rolled hard into the kitchen tile just as the beast's jaws slammed shut on empty air. Teeth clicked like a gunshot directly beside her ear. "Mine!" A voice shattered the room. Kaelen vaulted the kitchen island. Staying completely human, the king hit the charging wolf like a runaway freight train. They collided with the corridor wall. Plaster rained down in a thick, choking cloud. Elara scrambled backward on her hands and knees, wedging herself beneath the narrow prep table and covering her ringing ears. The struggle was devastating. The wolf tore deep, jagged ribbons into Kaelen's pale back. The king didn't even flinch. Reaching forward, he buried his thumbs into the beast's thick neck. Muscles corded along his arms as his golden irises ignited in the gloom. With a brutal, sweeping twist, bone snapped. The brown wolf collapsed against the baseboards. Dead weight. Drywall dust settled slowly over the carnage. The harsh, ragged breathing of the awakened soldiers filled the cabin. Kaelen rose from the wreckage, wiping a streak of crimson from his split lip. His torn back muscles were already smoking, the shredded skin knitting back together. He turned his burning gaze toward the table. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his chest heaving. "No," she rasped, coughing on the plaster dust as she crawled out from the shadows. He extended a broad, blood-slicked hand toward her, staring at his calloused palm. The true scale of her nightmare finally set in. She had to choose between the rabid dogs tearing at her walls or the apex predator offering her a lifeline. Forcing her trembling fingers forward, she placed her hand into his. His grip locked around hers, solid and surprisingly careful as he hoisted her to her feet. "They know we are in the back," Kaelen declared, his voice echoing off the broken wood. "The siege begins now." The safety of the cabin was permanently shattered. She racked the bolt of her rifle, pulling the stock tight to her shoulder. The screaming wind finally died, leaving behind a suffocating, dead silence. Morning light bled through the frosted glass, illuminating the violent reality of the cramped living room. The blizzard had broken. The mountain was completely clear, giving the cartel a perfect line of sight to her front porch. 15 scarred killers coated the floorboards, dead to the world. Even the king had finally succumbed to exhaustion and silver poison. His broad shoulders slumped against the barricaded front door. Elara stared at her calloused hands. The copper stench of the dead scout still hung in the stagnant air. She was a walking target, a blood debt dragging a kill squad right to the only sanctuary she had ever known. If she bolted into the tree line, the hunters would follow her scent. She could draw the wolves away. Shoving an extra box of rounds into a canvas duffel, she wrenched the laces of her winter boots tight. The metal action of her rifle clicked sharply as she checked the chamber. Stepping over the sleeping giants, she neared the shattered bedroom frame. A glint of metal caught the pale sunlight. The dead scout frozen in the snow wore a silver ring, deeply etched with a coiled snake. Her stomach pitched. The greasy manager at the city diner wore that exact band. The cartel hadn't just stumbled upon her. They had been tracking her for months. Forcing the dread down, she hoisted herself over the jagged glass and dropped into the knee-deep powder. Frost instantly bit through her denim. She drove her boots into the crust, carving a deliberate, bleeding trail straight toward the dense pines. She wanted the monsters to follow. A towering shadow detached from the frosted timber. The icy air vanished, replaced by the suffocating scent of dark thunder. Kaelen stepped directly into her path. "Where are you going?" he demanded, the gravel in his tone slicing straight to her bones. The icy crust cracked beneath his bare feet as Kaelen closed the gap between them. He locked his calloused hands over her shoulders. The grip felt like forged iron, but the tremor running through his thick arms betrayed a raw, violent panic. "You were leaving," he rasped, his unnatural gold eyes tearing through her defenses. Elara shoved both palms flat against his chest. "I am the bounty. The cartel will torch that cabin to the ground just to flush me out. I am trying to save your squad. You are my Luna." The absolute roar of his voice shook a cascade of snow from the overhead branches. "I do not trade my mate for a few hours of survival." The tree line violently erupted. 3 scarred soldiers launched from the frozen brush. They held dull black steel canisters instead of rifles. Valves hissed. A thick, vile yellow cloud of weaponized wolfsbane and silver dust sprayed directly into Kaelen's face. The mighty king collapsed to his knees. A guttural, agonizing scream tore from his throat as he clawed at his burning eyes. The hiss of the canisters faded into the biting wind. The snow beneath him stained black with his own toxic tears. He was completely blind. Survival burned away her shock. Elara drove her boots into the ice, throwing the rifle stock to her shoulder. The cartel soldiers cracked into their animal forms, lunging for the disabled predator. She pulled the trigger. The gunshot deafened her. The lead wolf snapped backward, painting the snow red before crumpling into the drifts. 2 remained, closing the distance fast while Kaelen swung his lethal, blind fists through empty air. "Kaelen!" she shrieked, refusing to retreat. His head snapped toward the pitch of her voice. 3 o'clock. Low. Trusting the Omega without a single flinch, he pivoted right and dropped his shoulder. His fist connected with bone. A sickening crack echoed through the clearing as the second beast folded in half against a tree trunk. 12 o'clock. High jump. He vaulted straight off the icy crust. His broad hands caught the leaping brown wolf squarely by the jaw in midair. They slammed into the snowbank together. Powdery snow settled slowly over the violent wreckage. Kaelen's chest heaved, his knuckles coated in fresh blood. The ringing in Elara's ears finally dialed back to a dull, throbbing hum. Then, a chorus of deep, mechanical growls echoed up the mountain pass. The main hunting party had found the trail. Grabbing his blood-slicked forearm, she hauled the blinded king toward the shattered window, shoving Kaelen through the jagged bedroom window frame. Elara tumbled onto the floorboards right behind him. The cabin erupted into chaos as 15 groggy soldiers realized their leader was bleeding and blind. "Luna, what hit him?" the blond boy demanded, gripping a rusted fire poker. "Silver gas," she barked, pushing past the panicked men. She dragged the stumbling giant straight into the cramped bathroom, forcing his broad shoulders down until he sat on the edge of the chipped porcelain tub. He looked entirely out of scale in her bruised, fragile world. Twisting the rusted faucet, she plunged a frayed washcloth into the freezing water. The metallic stench of the chemicals practically burned her own throat. "Lean back," she ordered softly. The lethal apex predator, a myth who tore men apart with his bare hands, tilted his head against the peeling wallpaper for a packless waitress. A low, ragged groan rattled his chest as she pressed the icy cloth over his blistered eyelids. Stripping away the toxic dust revealed the raw, burned skin underneath. Every defensive wall she had built over 5 years on the run began to crack under the weight of his absolute surrender. "You didn't run," Kaelen rasped into the cramped space. "I tried." She carefully rinsed the cloth, wringing out the yellow poison into the sink. "You wouldn't let me." "You fought for me." Reaching out blindly, his calloused fingers brushed the denim at her hip, anchoring her closer to his knees. "You commanded a king, and I obeyed." A fierce, dangerous heat bloomed directly in her chest. He didn't treat her like a fragile liability or a trophy. He treated her like a general on a battlefield. She gently dabbed the freezing cloth against his ruined skin one last time. Her knuckles grazed his rough jawline. He leaned into the contact, a dark, vibrating rumble starting deep in his throat. "Can you open them?" she asked, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Kaelen forced his eyelids apart. The glowing gold irises were bloodshot and raw, but the focused, predatory clarity locked dead onto her face. The air pressure in the tiny bathroom tripled. He dropped his gaze to her mouth. The synchronized crunch of heavy tires on frozen gravel violently shattered the quiet. 5 engines idled just beyond the thin wooden walls. The cartel had arrived for war. The freezing tap water in the porcelain tub rippled in perfect sync with the rhythmic crunch of thick tires on gravel outside. Kaelen didn't linger in the fragile quiet of the bathroom. The wounded man vanished, replaced by a weapon snapping out of a sheath. He rose to his full height, his glowing eyes locking onto the splintered wood of the living room door. Snatching the black rifle off the vanity, Elara chased his broad back into the cramped entryway. 15 scarred killers crouched low beneath the boarded windows. They clutched jagged chair legs and iron fire pokers, totally silent, waiting to bleed for their king. Pressing her cheek against the freezing drywall, Elara peered through a crack in the splintered oak. 5 black SUVs idled over her ruined garden, choking the crisp morning air with gray exhaust. Dozens of cartel enforcers poured from the dark chassis, dragging assault rifles, dull machetes, and thick iron chains through the snow. The phantom stench of damp concrete and rusted iron flooded her mouth. The exact metallic tang of the basement where they had caged her mother. She refused to go back into the dark. Pumping the action of the hunting rifle, the sharp, metallic clack echoed off the timber ceiling. Every killer in the room shifted their gaze toward her. She clicked off the safety, digging the heels of her winter boots into the floorboards, and leveled the barrel at the barricaded door. Kaelen paused in the center of the room. The amber light caught the absolute stillness in her posture. He didn't see a packless stray hiding behind cold steel. He saw a general ready to hold the line. "Hold!" Kaelen rumbled, the bass of his voice rattling the loose plaster above them. The crunch of boots outside stopped. Then, a single gunshot shattered the freezing morning. That single gunshot was the only warning before the front window detonated inward. A blinding hail of silver bullets shredded the thin cabin walls, turning the drywall into a choking fog of white plaster. Elara hit the floorboards hard, wrapping her arms over her skull as hot lead zipped inches above her hair. The noise ripped the oxygen from the room. The royal guard didn't cower. Barking guttural war cries, they hurled the broken dining table and cast-iron stove straight through the shattered glass at the shooters below. Flesh tore as they half-shifted, sprouting lethal claws and thick fur to block the incoming barrage. A violent crack from the kitchen severed the chaos. Someone was kicking down the rear entry. Splinters rained against the linoleum as the deadbolt gave way. Scrambling on hands and knees through the blinding dust, Elara reached the edge of the laminate counter just as the back door tore off its iron hinges. A cartel enforcer stepped over the wreckage, gripping a rust-stained machete. The sickening reek of stale beer and wet fur rolled off him. Spotting Elara huddled by the cabinets, a crooked smirk twisted his scarred face. "Found the little stray," he spat, taking a lazy, arrogant stride forward. He underestimated the stray. Elara didn't flinch. Driving the rifle stock into her bruised shoulder, she stared directly into his yellow irises and pulled the trigger. The brutal recoil slammed her backward against the lower cabinets as a blinding flash erupted from the barrel. The enforcer launched backward, crashing through the doorframe to land flat in the powdery snow. He didn't twitch. Plaster dust drifted lazily through the sudden, ringing quiet of the kitchen. A thin ribbon of white smoke curled from the hot steel in her hands. No guilt twisted her gut. A terrifying, dark adrenaline spiked her pulse. Kaelen materialized beside the counter, tracking the smoking barrel to the corpse in the snow. "My Luna fights!" he purred, the possessive rumble vibrating right into her boots. The wild claim no longer sparked fear. It lit a match directly over gasoline in her chest. She was a soldier in this war. Then, the erratic gunfire outside abruptly ceased. An unnatural, suffocating quiet smothered the bullet-riddled cabin. Pushing up from the kitchen tiles, Elara swallowed against the metallic taste of gunpowder coating the back of her throat. Gray smoke clung to the ceiling beams, mixing with the sharp copper tang of fresh wounds. The surviving guards crouched in the shadows, their chests heaving in the sudden lull. A harsh electronic screech tore through the yard, followed by the crackle of an amplifier. Little Elara, a mocking voice, echoed across the snow, her lungs paralyzed. Marcus, the cartel alpha who held the deed to her life. The monster from her worst nightmares had marched directly to her doorstep. Why had he sent a scout wearing her old diner manager's silver ring? The puzzle pieces clicked together, but the terrifying picture didn't matter right now. "I know you're in there hoarding wounded strays," Marcus shouted over the megaphone. "I am a reasonable businessman. Send the girl out to pay her debts, and the rest of you mutts can walk away." A blatant lie from a snake. "You have 60 seconds, Marcus drawled, his tone dripping with lethal amusement. "Before I torch this shack with everyone locked inside." The sickly, sweet, chemical stench of gasoline drifted through the shattered window frames. They were soaking the front porch. Panic clawed up her throat. The royal guards were bleeding out on her rugs, boxed in by a raging inferno waiting for a match. Lowering the hot barrel of her rifle, the crushing weight of her own guilt forced her toward the entryway. Sacrificing one life to save 15 felt like the only math that mattered. A broad, calloused hand clamped onto her shoulder, arresting her momentum. Kaelen spun her around. The amber glow in his eyes had been entirely consumed by a dark, apocalyptic void. Another man had just claimed his equal as property. Another man had just threatened her life. The ambient heat in the cabin spiked. "You do not surrender," Kaelen growled, the vibration tearing through his chest like a demonic engine. "They have gasoline," she choked out, hot tears blurring her vision. "They will burn you alive." Releasing her shoulder, the king didn't waste oxygen on a reply. He pivoted on his heel and marched directly toward the bullet-ridden entryway. Kicking the splintered barricade aside like kindling, he stepped out onto the fuel-soaked porch, exposing himself to 50 armed enforcers. Laughter barked through the megaphone. "Look at the stupid hero! Light him up!" Before a single trigger could snap, Kaelen threw his head back. A deafening, bone-rattling roar shattered the remaining glass in the cabin. He didn't just shift. He detonated. Pale skin ripped apart as pitch black. Armored fur violently erupted. Scythe-like claws tore through his fingertips, and jagged bone spikes ripped through his spine as he stretched to 9 feet of prehistoric muscle. Assault rifles clattered into the snow as the cartel frontline fell back in absolute horror. They hadn't cornered a stray. They had just locked themselves in a cage with the king of monsters. The shattered remnants of the window frame bit into Elara's palms as she stared out at the massacre. What followed defied all laws of natural physics. The king did not just fight the cartel, he erased them. 9 feet of prehistoric muscle, wrapped in pitch-black fur and jagged bone spikes, moved with terrifying, liquid speed. He drove scythe-like claws straight through the reinforced steel chassis of the SUVs, peeling armor plating away like aluminum foil. The stench of ruptured diesel tanks and hot blood completely overpowered the freezing wind. She watched him lift a screaming enforcer by the throat, the man's legs kicking wildly before Kaelen casually tossed him into the tree line. The deafening crunch of a military-grade rifle folding under his heel echoed over the mountain pass. Defending his sanctuary turned Kaelen into a god of war, spinning a dark, horrific poetry out of severed limbs and crushed bone. A guttural, triumphant cheer ripped from the throats of the bleeding guards directly behind her in the cabin. The sound cracked open a fierce, unfamiliar hope in her chest. That hope died 3 seconds later. Marcus, the cartel alpha, hadn't been shredded by the Lycan. The coward had retreated behind the final idling SUV. Dropping his assault rifle, he hoisted a thick, tubular launcher onto his shoulder. He didn't aim at the beast. He aimed directly at the center of the bloody snowbank. Thwump, thwump, thwump. 3 steel canisters detonated in the yard. A violent hiss pierced the air before a massive, unnaturally thick cloud of neon green smoke exploded outward. The suffocating stench of rotting eggs and burning copper instantly reached the porch. Weaponized silver gas. Concentrated and incredibly lethal to the shifting gene. The unstoppable king of monsters froze mid-stride. The toxic fog swallowed his massive silhouette. From deep within the chemical haze, a wet, rattling gasp tore through the freezing air, a sound of absolute suffocating agony that made Elara's blood run cold. The silver burned the oxygen directly out of his lungs. The 9-foot prehistoric nightmare violently folded in on itself. He hit the snow with a sickening, heavy thud. Stripped of his ancient armor, the gas forced him painfully back into his scarred, human form. He rolled onto his side, coughing black blood onto the white powder. The dense green fog drifted lazily toward the porch steps. Refusing to abandon their king, the 15 royal guards lunged through the shattered doorway. The second they hit the chemical wall, their legs gave out. They collapsed against the wooden planks like cut puppets, gagging, choking, their claws tearing desperately at their own burning throats. The invincible shield had just been completely shattered. From the dark edge of the timberline, cartel enforcers stepped forward, their faces hidden behind thick black respirators. Gripping long, silver-tipped pikes, they formed a tight, silent circle around Kaelen's twitching body. The trap snapped completely shut. The ringing in Elara's ears dialed up to a deafening pitch. She stumbled backward, bumping against the kitchen island. Tendrils of green gas curled through the shattered drywall, stinging her eyes and catching the back of her throat. But it didn't burn her from the inside out. Her human biology, completely devoid of the shifting gene, rendered her immune to the silver poison. The reality of the math hit her with brutal clarity. There was exactly 1 move left on the board to stop the slaughter. The phantom weight of rotting guilt settled on her chest, the exact same crushing shame she swallowed at 10 years old, hiding silently beneath the floorboards while debt collectors dragged her screaming mother to a van. She had survived by being invisible. She had paid for that survival with her soul. She refused to hide under the floorboards again. Releasing her grip, the empty hunting rifle clattered uselessly against the linoleum tiles. She dragged the zipper of her thin denim coat up to her chin. Swallowing the metallic taste of fear, she wiped the plaster dust from her stinging eyes and turned toward the splintered entryway. She stepped directly out of the ruined doorway. Navigating over the violently convulsing guards on the porch, she descended the wooden steps and sank into the knee-deep powder. She raised both empty hands high above her head, exposing her unarmored chest to the firing squad. "Cease fire!" she shrieked, the raw volume tearing her vocal cords. "Stop! I surrender!" Marcus reached up, unlatching the heavy respirator from his face. A jagged, victorious smile stretched his scarred cheeks. "Well, well," the little stray mouse finally walks into the light. Dropping her hands, Elara waded straight into the circle of monsters. Ignoring the hungry yellow stares of the enforcers, she dropped to her knees in the blood-soaked snow beside Kaelen. The Alpha King lay on his side, his broad chest heaving as he fought for a single clean breath. Ugly, blistering chemical burns marred his pale skin. The unnatural gold of his eyes was bloodshot and dim. Tracking her movement, genuine, unadulterated panic shattered his stoic features. "No," he choked out, a thick line of red dripping from his chin. "Elara, don't." She reached down. Her trembling fingers brushed a sweat-soaked lock of dark hair away from his burning forehead, leaving a clean streak across his ash-stained skin. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her throat closing tight. "I can't watch them put you in the ground." The crippling terror of returning to a cage finally lost to the absolute certainty that she couldn't let him die. A heavy, leather-clad hand locked onto the scruff of her coat. Marcus violently yanked her to her feet, lifting her toes entirely out of the snow. Smart choice, Omega. Your blood debt is officially called in. A sickening crack echoed over the wind. Kaelen drove his bare fist directly into the frozen earth in a display of pure, paralyzed rage. Before the king could force himself upright, a thick plastic zip tie brutally locked around Elara's wrists. The sharp, serrated edges bit directly into her skin. Marcus shoved her hard toward the idling engine of the lead SUV. The descent into the dark had officially begun. The heavy steel door of the SUV slammed shut, severing the freezing wind and plunging Elara into suffocating darkness. She collapsed sideways onto the cracked leather bench. The thick plastic binding her wrists behind her back forced her shoulders into a dull, agonizing ache. The stale, claustrophobic air tasted of cheap tobacco, wet dog, and overpowering cologne, the exact sensory fingerprint of her deepest trauma. The front passenger door wrenched open. Marcus dropped into the bucket seat, slamming the metal shut. The driver immediately threw the transmission into gear. The heavy, studded tires spun violently in the powder before catching traction. As the massive chassis lurched forward, Elara awkwardly twisted her bound torso, pressing her cheek against the freezing tinted glass of the rear window. The green fog in the yard was finally thinning. Kaelen remained grounded in the bloody snow. Stripped of his power, the broken king could do nothing but watch the taillights of the convoy drag his mate down the mountain. A physical, hollow tearing sensation ripped through the center of her chest. The sky bruised a dark, heavy purple as the SUV bounced aggressively down the winding, unplowed access road. She was leaving the only sanctuary she had ever known. She was leaving the apex predator who had burned for her. She was driving straight back into the collar. "You racked up a hell of a bill. Little stray?" Marcus laughed from the passenger seat, not bothering to glance in the rearview mirror. But watching the great Lycan King choking in the dirt? Completely worth the mileage. Elara kept her mouth shut. The cold glass numbed her forehead. Utter, paralyzing despair washed the adrenaline completely out of her blood. The dashboard lights clicked on, casting a dim, sickly green glow over the front console. Marcus reached up, lazily pulling the thick black leather glove off his right hand. Elara stopped breathing. A heavy silver ring gleamed on his index finger. A thick, custom band carved with a serpent devouring its own tail. The bottom fell completely out of her world. The greasy manager at the city diner wore that exact ring. He had smiled warmly 5 years ago, handed her an apron, and promised her the kitchen was a safe zone. He had played the protective uncle perfectly. He hadn't been hiding her. He had been holding her leash for his cartel brother. The quiet off-grid life, the cash under the table job, the illusion that she had outsmarted the hunters, it was all a meticulously engineered lie. She hadn't been a ghost. She had been a lab rat in a glass jar, and they had just decided to screw the lid tight. The final, desperate spark of fight in her chest suffocated and died. The game was rigged from the start. The king was poisoned, her entire 5 years of freedom was a stage play, and the monsters had permanently won. Sinking lower against the cracked leather, she closed her eyes against the darkness and let the silence swallow her whole. The dark interior of the SUV pitched violently as studded tires chewed through the frozen mountain ruts. Suffocating silence choked the cabin, broken only by the low, arrogant chuckle of Marcus sitting in the passenger seat. Beside Elara in the back, a scarred enforcer purposely slammed his broad shoulder against hers as the chassis hit a dip. A wet, guttural snicker rattled his throat. "Look at the little stray leak," the guard mocked. "She misses her dead mutt." Elara dragged her bruised cheek against the rough denim of her shoulder. The freezing draft slipping through the window seals chilled the wet tracks on her face. The tears weren't born from terror. The hollow, bleeding ache radiating from her ribs belonged entirely to the memory of the fallen king. A flicker of a memory surfaced a feral stray dog trapped in a dead-end alley back in the city, surrounded by brutes wielding iron pipes. The animal didn't cower. It bared bloody teeth and tore open an ankle. She had spent 5 years cowering beneath the floorboards, but Kaelen hadn't treated her like a victim. He treated her like an equal. He crowned her. The cold rod of fear in her stomach ignited into white-hot, blinding rage. Then, a vicious jolt of static arched directly through her sternum. It wasn't a physical blow. The invisible tether of the mate bond violently snapped taut, burning a brand straight into her marrow. Deep within her own bones, a rolling, apocalyptic fury echoed up the mountain. Kaelen wasn't in the dirt. He was awake, sliding her numb, bound fingertips down the lining of her coat pocket. The sharp, jagged edge of a broken window shard-bit into her thumb. She curled her palm around the hidden glass, letting the sting anchor her focus. Glancing up, she caught the driver staring at the Cartel Alpha in the rearview mirror. The driver's knuckles stretched white against the steering wheel, his teeth grinding audibly in the suffocating quiet. Why did a loyal soldier look ready to slit his own boss's throat? She didn't know the politics, but she absolutely intended to weaponize them. For the next 40 miles, Elara tracked the driver's simmering resentment through the dim dashboard lights. Marcus remained completely absorbed in his own arrogance, barking brags into a satellite phone, entirely blind to the mutiny brewing inches from his shoulder. As the digital beep of the ending call severed the quiet, Elara shifted her bound wrists and leaned an inch closer to the steel grate separating the seats. "He plans to take the credit," she murmured, pitching her voice under the hum of the engine. The driver's gaze snapped to the rearview mirror. "Shut it, Stray," he grunted, but the command lacked any actual venom. She watered the poisonous seed. "He sits in the heated leather while you navigate the ice. He wears the silver ring, but you pull the triggers. Put a starving wolf against a lazy, overfed dog, and the wolf tears the throat out every single time. Hunger breeds violence." The driver swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing against his dirty collar. He didn't order her to be quiet again. He didn't alert his alpha. Instead, the enforcer jerked the steering wheel hard to the right, deliberately plunging the front tire into a brutal, jagged pothole. The suspension screamed. Boiling coffee vaulted from Marcus's insulated cup, soaking his expensive leather jacket. As the Cartel Alpha shrieked and cursed the freezing spill, a dark, wicked smirk pulled at the corner of the driver's mouth. The pack was fracturing. Deep within her chest, the invisible tether pulsed. Thump, thump, thump. Closing her eyes against the dim cabin light, the phantom scent of crushed pine and raw ozone flooded her senses. The king was mobilizing. She had no idea how he expelled the toxic silver, but his commanding, lethal intent rushed down the mountain like an avalanche. He wasn't tracking her to negotiate. He was coming to slaughter. Pressing the shard of glass deeper into her palm, she mapped the veins in the guard's neck sitting beside her. She just needed to buy the avalanche 5 more minutes. The rhythmic crunch of snow suddenly vanished. The tires gripped smooth, solid asphalt. They had crossed the city limits, driving straight into the iron jaws of the cartel. Neon streetlights bled into absolute darkness as the convoy slammed the brakes behind an impenetrable wall of corrugated steel. Grinding gears echoed through the freezing air as 20-foot iron gates swung inward, swallowing the vehicles into a sprawling industrial wasteland. The suffocating stench of scorched engine grease, rusted iron, and dried blood immediately coated Elara's throat. Rough hands dragged her from the leather seat. Boots kicked the back of her knees, forcing her down into the oil-stained concrete. "Welcome to the end of the line, Omega," Marcus sneered, his shadow falling over her kneeling form. Twisting his fingers into her dark hair, he violently hauled her toward the center of a cavernous, empty warehouse. Dozens of cartel mercenaries formed a wide, jagged perimeter around the open floor. They rattled their assault rifles, howling and jeering like rabid strays. Dirt ground into her knees, but Elara refused to bow her head. Planting her boots on the concrete, she forced herself upright. She squared her bruised shoulders, locking her stare directly onto Marcus's yellow irises. A packless waitress surrounded by an army of monsters, radiating the absolute, unshakable authority of a reigning queen. "You just made a fatal miscalculation," she stated, the syllables sharp and totally steady. Marcus threw his head back, barking an ugly, echoing laugh. "Who exactly is going to stop me? Your rotting mutt?" Before the echo of his taunt could fade, the air pressure inside the warehouse violently dropped. Loose gravel and trash whipped into a frantic cyclone across the concrete. A deafening, rhythmic vibration hammered against the rusted tin roof. 4 pitch-black military stealth choppers materialized over the shattered glass of the skylights, completely blotting out the pale moonlight. The screaming engines drowned out the cartel's jeers. Thick tactical ropes dropped straight through the broken glass into the center of the kill box. Looking up at the descending shadows, the mercenaries froze. Assault rifles rattled against shaking thighs. The arrogant smirks dissolved into raw, unfiltered terror as they realized the corpse on the mountain had just tracked them home. The suffocating reek of oil and blood vanished, instantly replaced by the terrifying, ozone-charged scent of dark thunder. The king had arrived to burn the empire to the ground. The rusted, corrugated steel of the warehouse roof imploded with a deafening screech. Thick tactical ropes snaked through the shattered skylights directly into the dirt. Lycan soldiers dropped from the shadows, bypassing their beast forms to rely entirely on pure, brute momentum. Cartel enforcers scrambled to raise assault rifles, but the strike force was already inside their guard. The horrific, wet crunch of bones snapping against concrete echoed off the tin walls. Marcus panicked. Snatching Elara by the hair, he dragged her violently backward into the shadows of the loading dock. Yanking a jagged silver blade from his belt, he pressed the freezing metal flush against her carotid artery. "Stand down!" Marcus shrieked, his voice cracking as the slaughter unfolded. The center chopper roared overhead. A towering silhouette plummeted straight through the breach without a line. Kaelen slammed into the concrete floor, the impact sending a spiderweb of cracks through the foundation. Rising from the dust, his golden eyes locked dead onto Elara. A lethal, vibrating growl started deep in his chest. Before the king could lunge, the angry driver from the SUV stepped squarely into Marcus's path. Dropping his sidearm onto the oil-stained floor, the driver raised both hands high in surrender. The poisonous seeds of mutiny she planted in the dark vehicle had bloomed. The cartel was fracturing from the inside out. "I will gut her!" Marcus roared, the silver blade breaking the skin of her neck. A warm bead of blood trickled down her collarbone. Adrenaline overrode her panic. Elara twisted her bound wrists behind her back, her fingers finding the jagged shard of cabin glass buried in her pocket. Wrapping her palm tight around the makeshift shiv, the sharp edge sliced directly into her own palm. She ignored the burn. Twisting her torso, she drove the glass shard deep into the cartel alpha's thigh. Marcus shrieked, his grip faltering as the silver blade clattered to the floor. Kaelen covered the distance before the knife stopped spinning. Seizing Marcus by the throat, the king slammed him brutally into the concrete. Plaster rained from the ceiling. Kaelen drew back a fist of exposed scythe-like claws, fully prepared to rip the screaming man into ribbons. "Wait!" Elara gasped, her voice raw. The apex predator froze. Suspending a lethal blow inches from Marcus's face, Kaelen looked up. He kept the cartel alpha pinned to the dirt, but the decision belonged entirely to his Luna. Staring down at the pathetic, bleeding coward who had stolen 5 years of her life, Elara kicked the silver blade away. Snatching the heavy iron fire extinguisher from the loading dock pillar, she didn't hesitate. She swung the red cylinder down hard against Marcus's temple. The cartel alpha went entirely limp. The metallic ring of the extinguisher hitting the concrete was the only sound left in the room. The debt was paid. She refused to let his blood permanently stain her hands. The metallic tang of blood and engine grease settled heavily over the silent warehouse. Surviving enforcers were bound and bleeding on the concrete, guarded by Lycans holding the perimeter doors. The crushing, claustrophobic pressure of the last 12 hours evaporated, replaced by a sudden, violent exhaustion. Elara dropped the fire extinguisher. The adrenaline crash hit her joints like liquid lead, her knees buckling beneath her. She just needed to breathe. Kaelen rose from the unconscious cartel alpha. Stepping over the body, he closed the distance and caught her before she hit the dirt. Gently taking her bound hands, his razor-sharp claws slid through the thick plastic zip ties with effortless precision. The plastic snapped. Her bruised wrists throbbed as circulation rushed back into her hands, but the sting barely registered. Shrugging off his heavy, fur-lined coat, Kaelen wrapped the thick material tightly around her shivering shoulders. The suffocating scent of fresh pine and dark thunder instantly grounded her racing pulse. A single, hot tear broke free, carving a clean track through the dirt and plaster dust on her cheek. "It's over," Kaelen rumbled, the vibration of his chest settling straight into her bones. "They will never touch you again." She let her weight fully collapse against his solid frame. Thick, corded arms wrapped around her, pulling her completely flush against his heartbeat. Footsteps crunched against the gravel. The ash-blonde soldier from the mountains stepped forward, a tourniquet wound tight around his bicep. Despite the blood loss, a brilliant, genuine smile split his face. He dropped to one knee, bowing his head. "The perimeter is secure, my Luna," the boy reported. The title didn't trigger a panic attack this time. It didn't sound like a cage or a collar. It sounded like armor. She had bled for this pack, and they had bled for her. "Thank you," she rasped, dipping her chin to the young warrior. Kaelen looked down at her. He didn't see a packless stray hiding in the dirt. He saw a survivor who had manipulated a mutiny, stabbed an alpha, and ordered a king. Cupping her jaw with a massive, calloused hand, his thumb gently wiped the tear from her cheek. She tried to maintain a stoic front, but her lower lip betrayed a violent tremble. He leaned down. The kiss wasn't a brutal claim of ownership. It was agonizingly slow, a gentle, reverent surrender that stripped away the last of her defenses. He tasted of rain and ozone. She had dragged a dying wolf out of a blizzard, and he had burned an empire to the ground just to keep her safe. The tinted windows of the SUV reflected the towering neon skyline of the Lycan capital. The vehicle descended smoothly into a subterranean garage beneath a glittering glass monolith. The ambient temperature was sterile and warm, carrying the sharp scent of expensive car wax, a stark, jarring shift from the freezing drafts of her mountain cabin. The engine idled. The doors unlocked with a soft click. Stepping out onto the polished epoxy floor, Elara pulled Kaelen's oversized coat tighter around her stained denim. 24 elite royal guards waited in perfectly spaced formation by the private elevator banks. The second her boots hit the concrete, the entire detail dropped to one knee. The synchronized thud of armor hitting the floor echoed through the cavernous garage. They didn't bow to the returning king. Their heads were bowed directly to her. Kaelen stepped out of the shadows, moving to stand perfectly parallel with her shoulder. He didn't lead. He didn't trail. "Welcome home, little one," Kaelen murmured, the gravel in his voice sending a hot shiver down her spine. Staring up at his scarred profile, the crushing phantom weight of the cartel debt finally dissolved into nothing. The 5-year sprint was over. No more fake names, no more checking the locks, no more hiding beneath the floorboards. Survival had always demanded absolute isolation, but standing beside the apex predator, she realized true safety required a pack. Reaching out, she slid her small hand into his broad, calloused palm, lacing her fingers tightly through his. "It's definitely got better heating than my cabin," she muttered, a dry, genuine smirk breaking across her face for the first time in years. A dark, rolling chuckle vibrated in his chest. "We can fill it with as many strays as you require." The polished steel doors of the private elevator chimed, sliding open to reveal the bright ascent ahead. Stepping across the threshold with her hand locked in the grip of the king, Elara left the stray in the basement. She was the Luna of the Lycan realm, and for the first time in her life, she had absolutely no desire to run.